Bonjour à tous et à tous.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Friederike Hoffmann. I am the Paris correspondent for Handelsblatt, and we're going to talk about an issue which is both economic, strategic, and also political. Can we hope for a genuine industrial rebound? France has seen major industrial decline. The share of manufacturing industry in GDP has fallen from 16% at the turn of the century to 10%, but there's some promising side with some very concrete industrial projects in the areas of batteries in Marseille around energy and infrastructure, and there are new projects right across the French territory. So I'm hoping that with our panel here, we will not only identify the obstacles, but also clarify what is necessary in order to transform these signals into a genuine industrial rebound. So I've got with me here Claude Imovan, who is chairman of the board at Orano. We've got Olivier Scalabre, who is CEO of BCG France. We've got Émilie Piet, who is chairwoman of the French Electricity Board, RTE. Philippe Pascal, who is chairman and CEO of ADP Group. We've also got Philippe Maillat, who is CEO of APAV, and Henrik Stiesdal, founder and CTO of Stiesdal, the pioneer of modern wind power. Thank you to all of you. Before we get into debate, I'm going to first of all hand the floor to El Mahoub Mahoud. You are chair of PSA University, economist and member of the Circle of Economists. You've worked a lot on industrialization and value chains. Could you perhaps set the scene a little bit for our discussion this afternoon? Where is Europe at in terms of reindustrialization, and what are our fragilities? Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here because it's very warm. I'm going to be a little bit provocative with three questions. First of all, where is industry at right now? Are we really reindustrializing? Second question, have we really taken a measure of the deindustrialization we've been through? Are we forgetting things? And thirdly, how can we reimagine and rethink reindustrialization? I think that we're looking at the question with a slightly outdated perspective. As Friederike said, deindustrialization has affected all OECD countries. So within the OECD, about 23% of jobs are in manufacturing industry. If we define manufacturing industry, manufacturing jobs, that represents 23% of jobs. That was in 1970, 23%. Now, in 2023, the average in OECD countries was 12%. In France, we've not been doing great because it's now 10% of GDP. Manufacturing represented 17% in 1980. Germany is a bit better off. Not quite so good in football. They didn't win their knockout game, but Germany's manufacturing industry represents GDP in 2023. It's been falling, but less than in France. German specialities have been preserved, but it's struggling now with the competition from China's EV industries. When you look at what's going on in America, manufacturing industry represents 11% of GDP, despite all of the money invested to reindustrialize. Manufacturing industry has fell from 13% to 10% of GDP by 2023, with about 8% of employment, despite all of the billions of dollars that have been put on the table, not just since Trump came to power, but also under Biden and Obama. So we've seen deindustrialization of employment, but the USA has some niches and some technological prowess. In terms of China, manufacturing industry represents around a quarter of GDP because it's got into globalization much later, and its manufacturing facilities lead the world. There's major industrialization with an increase in capacity and capabilities, and export pressure which remains very high. Undoubtedly, when we look at the title of the session, it says hoping for an industrial rebound. We can't see this rebound coming. If we can measure it in terms of the share of manufacturing employment in total employment, this level has remained stable. If you look at the share in terms of added value, it's remained the same as well. So the question we could ask is, are we really properly measuring deindustrialization? Do we realize what's been going on? There's been a significant rise in service industries, there's been a significant rise in technological industries, which are listed often as service industries. So in manufacturing industry, about 40% of the jobs there are actually service jobs in what's classified as manufacturing industry. So if I get the key services such as knowledge-based services, and we compare that with the manufacturing industry, onboard of software, things like that, does that make the situation a bit better? About maybe 10 to 12% of service employments are key drivers for industrial competitivity. So we get to about 18 to 23% of jobs within France. France looks a bit better when we take into account services. I'm not talking about domestic cleaning or home care services, but real services that have a key impact on manufacturing industry. But even so, when we compare with Germany, there's a 10-point gap. So France is not really doing that great. Third point for me, before I wrap up, are we thinking about reindustrialization in a world where we're looking at things with an outdated perspective? I think it's a bit outdated the way we're looking at it, because we've moved on from a world which was governed by comparative advantage, the world of hyperglobalization from about 1990 to 2010, where the value chains were getting longer, and it was just about comparative advantages to get the most out of globalization. Since 2010, value chains have become more nationalized, and the world has changed. It's very clear. We've moved from a world where it was about comparative advantage to with multilateral regulations. We're into a world of techno-imperialism, whereby if you don't have some key strengths within certain critical technologies, then you no longer have any role to play in world competition. So the key point here is that if you take, for example, artificial intelligence, this isn't a situation where you need to think sector by sector, but by technological system, technologies and systems, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in discussion. But when we look at this point, this issue in concrete terms, there's many good reasons to be worried, because the US dominate a number of choke points, GPU chips for AI, venture capital. Taiwan controls natural choke points because 70% of semiconductors are produced there. South Korea dominates electronic memories. Japan has a key role in critical minerals. China controls critical minerals and rare earths, as well as Europe has one key choke point, lithography, the screen printing that's used for chip making. That's one key choke point. It's not just about having a comparative advantage in the specialization, it's about controlling a fundamental choke point, technological choke point. And if you don't have such a thing, you need to get in alliance with a key player. So what are the right alliances in the world's technological system, which is governed by this rising techno-imperialism? When you look at the industrial groups that have such a dominant role in the Trump administration, you've got fossil fuel energy sectors, but also the big tech sector. And in such a context, the European situation is very fragile. There's a lot of good research in France and in Europe, but the downstream side of the value chains and that aspect of innovation leaves a lot to be desired. There's a bit of a risk aversion, and we find that both in terms of public policy makers and private sector decision makers. We can't really talk about an industrial rebound for now. Thank you very much, Mahmoud. I think we've understood there's a lot still to be done. So as we turn to our speakers for discussion, what we want to do is to move from diagnosis to some very concrete examples of act on. We're going to start with Mr. Imovan. We've heard the figures. 16% of GDP was manufacturing industry in 2000. Now we're down to 10%. What needs to be reindustrialized as a priority in your view? Well, of course, not everything can be reindustrialized, particularly in a time when public finances are tight, to say the least. We've talked a lot about international competition in some of the different forums here. We've seen some very rapid technological changes, so we need to make some choices. What technologies, what sectors, what industrial capabilities are essential for our prosperity, for our security, and for our independent decision-making? What are the key links in the value chain that we need to control? I think that's what the industrial rebound is all about. Nuclear power is a key example. Strategic value is not just about resource access, uranium mines or whatever it is, but it's about controlling a whole value chain. Technologies, industrial capabilities, but also competencies and talents, supply chains, logistical flows. We've seen logistical issues, and it's this control which creates sovereignty. It's true for nuclear industries, but also for batteries, for rare earths, for semiconductors, for AI, and for other forms of energy. So in conclusion, the industrial rebound that we're looking for requires us to identify and control these key strategic links in the chain. A national industry doesn't need to produce everything, but needs to stay in control of what's essential for its autonomy. Olivier Scalabro, you said that there's a threat of a second wave of deindustrialization in Europe. What's the urgency and what are the key markers that highlight this development for you? You've already described the first wave, and the key thing is that we don't want to have a second wave, but I believe there is a new industrial revolution that is happening right now. If we don't do anything, the second wave of deindustrialization is going to hit us, and hit us hard. Why do I say that? It's what I refer to as physical AI. What do I mean by that? I'm talking about artificial intelligence moving out of the screens and desktops to go into the factory floors and production sector. One aspect of this is humanoid robots. You've seen those. You also have AI to drive them. And the second component of that is the compute power, which is required to run artificial intelligence. And in these two areas, China is taking a role as an industrial leader in these areas. So we're no longer in a situation where China is a low-cost nation. China is now a technological leader. About 50% of industrial robots are used in China today. When we look at AI applied to robotics, China is leader in the field. And when we look at compute power, it's mainly deployed in China, and the cost of each token is 20% lower in China than in Europe or in the USA. So this second wave of reindustrialization is something that's going to pass us by if we don't do anything, because China is going to remain leader. China is leading the pack right now. We've carried out a number of studies, and we've said, what will happen if we don't do anything? Hopefully we will do something and we'll make a place. But if we don't do anything, 40% of manufacturing and production is going to be threatened. 40% represents the same scale as the first deindustrialization that we talked of. The challenge is the same scale of the first wave of deindustrialization. So Europe and France need to wake up quickly. Thank you, Olivier. We've understood that it's very urgent, and the technologies you mentioned require energy. That's something that France has quite a lot of. France generates a lot of carbon-free energy, but there are some blockers, things that are preventing industrial development. Emily Pieter, what are the key problems that we see, even if in France we've got a lot of electricity supply?
So in fact, there is no blockage as such. But you know, if it's about a connection for industrial project, be it for decarbonation or for the economic attractiveness, because we do attract investors thanks to our low carbon electricity, which is abundant and competitive versus the rest of Europe. But of course, there should be interconnections. So what we see at this stage is that there are demands for connection to the electricity transport network, high and very high voltage, but we get mainly major industrial projects, data centers, hydrogen production plants. But this number of requests doubles every year. So it is very promising, which means that electrical consumption is increasing, and therefore we will see this in the coming years. Just one figure, if only 50% of such projects take place, we will reach the decarbonization trajectory set as an objective by the government. So it is essential for us to get there. And we have to be faster on the delivery times. We have to be ready, we have to help these industrialists who are waiting for the connection. So today we got about 33 gigawatts to give you an idea of projects which are in the pipe waiting for the connection, 3 times the installed power of the French industry today. So it's quite promising for tomorrow. Simply, they're just waiting. They're still waiting. So we got leverages. We're activating a number of leveraging systems or instruments. And so first, localization of the project. The farther you are, the more time it takes. The management of the queue. How do you define priorities? How do you optimize the priority line? Everything which is upstream phase, regulation, administrative procedures, and so on and so forth, and reinforcement of the electricity transport networks or grid will take time. A major investment, 100 billion euros in the next 15 years, and which will have to go with this. So no blockage, but leveraging the system. So this leads us to the question of infrastructure. Mr. Pascal, is this now the central pillars of reindustrialization? Well, infrastructures, especially in airports, this is one of the main instruments for industrial rebound. Well, managing infrastructures, especially in airports, you have to relocalize the wealth in France, attract, but to also project the know-how, industrial know-how, to foreign countries, and we have a huge potential. We do have a huge potential. Just Group IDP, we have 26. We manage 26 airports in the world. The 3 main airports, in Paris, Charles de Gaulle. You can see that this is the first border in Europe. This is 80% of foreign tourists coming to France come through Charles de Gaulle Airport. And we can see this is an instrument that will attract tourists, but business as well. It is the first role. Second role, it's a projection. And the projection exists today. It is measured 13% of the value of French foreign trade goes through the cargoes holds of Charles de Gaulle Airport. So therefore alone, it makes it possible to work for the industry and grow the industry and project it. So this player has to be competitive and he must be able to grow. The airport is no longer a monopoly. We have to say that it is in competition with other infrastructures. The industrial competition goes through the competition of infrastructures. And this means that there must be investment, and mainly investment in our ability to grow that we have in France with, with underlying infrastructures, airport, roads, rails, electrical, which is major, and that will make it possible to have this rebound. But let's invest. So it's more the issue of ecosystem. So, Mr. Maillard, why should we change the software for this industrial rebound? Well, first you need to love industry. And I'm asking myself, this software change that has to take place, that doesn't, Europe focused on consumers market, the 400 million consumers, and everything was done to facilitate this market of the 400 million consumers without thinking about the industrialist and the impact on the industry. And of course, it's starting to change, but it's very slow. We are the European today to protect or help industrialists for all reasons of sovereignty, reasons we know it's important. And Europe has to send a strong signal. It was not the case necessarily everywhere. Then there are the issues of regulation and adaptation to the implementation of plans. Today, deadlines are very long for reasons of choice, which have been assumed, are accepted, but also for over-transposition of complexity of standards or choices we make. And the choice maybe will need to be reviewed. Should we study for 1 year, biodiversity to install a plant? It's a choice we've made, totally respectable, but then don't get surprised if the the construction of a plant, the deadline or the production time is long, and when a construction time is long. So if you have a real dialogue with the states, the various people who are concerned, and we deal with the situations, we can go fast. Third topic: do we like the industry? Do we have a good image of our plants? I doubt it. I doubt it. And do we want to have a plant next door? Is the plant of today is that of yesterday? You mentioned it. I think let's not reproduce the Industrial Revolution. Tomorrow's plant will have a digital protection. We'll have to respect the environment. It has to be integrated now to make sure that we love the industry. And last point, we need men and women for such plants. We need to build the plants. We need to run them. There will be more robots. There will be more AI. I'm aware of that, but we will need men and women who love the industry to work at it. And so there is a stack of education, of attractiveness of towards industries, and not just service or consulting or lawyers or whatever, which are quite legitimate and respectable. But I think we got to restore the attractiveness of professions-based, industry-based professions. So this is a job for the society and the country. Mr. Stidal, we talked about electricity. Now, energy sovereignty, in your opinion, is this the basic condition for a true industrial rebound?
Yes, and it is for many, many reasons. I think that the most fundamental reason is that Europe cannot be in a situation where it can be blackmailed. We were not blackmailed 10 years ago. But since 10 years ago, we have learned the blackmail situation when Putin used gas as a weapon against us when we wanted to support Ukraine. And we have also seen America change their course completely. Where we used to have an ally, we now have somebody threatening to take our property. I say that as a Danish person, somewhat engaged in the location called Greenland. We have seen China use access to raw materials like rare earths completely shamelessly. And there, if we want to be able to be masters of our own fate, then we cannot let others blackmail us. We need to be sovereign. As Carney said from Canada in his fantastic speech in Davos, the old days are gone. They will not come back. And there are people out there who either want to hurt us or who do things like attacking Iran without any concern for our situation. And from an industrial player, being in a situation where you have to say, I don't know what is the cost of my product because I don't know what is the cost of my energy because somebody else is weaponizing energy, is simply not a base on which we can reindustrialize Europe. We need to be sovereign. We need to be masters of our own fate. And in that context, of course, France sets a fantastic example with nuclear power and renewables, 95% decarbonized electricity supply. Denmark, I think, sets a frame on renewables. You mentioned the number of gigawatts people are wanting to install here. Just to give you the story, in Denmark we have 4.5 gigawatts average load, 7 gigawatts peak load. The queue today, a lot of it from data centers, from American players, is not 4.5 or 7, it is about 60 gigawatts people want to install. So that's what we are confronted with. In that situation, we cannot be blackmailed. The good news is that it is eminently doable. Europe has all the cards on the hand with solar, wind, nuclear, biomass, hydro to become energy independent of the world around us. And we need to grab that, and we need to grab that fast.
Que ça sent vraiment des bonnes nouvelles. Merci beaucoup. Alors, si on peut.
Good news, thank you. So to summarize your words, we could say that a new era is beginning now. So we need to create make decisions. For me, the first question I will put to Mr. Rebound, which industries do we want to develop? I mean, do we concentrate purely on a few strategic domains, or should we integrate the entire value chain in Europe?
That's a difficult issue. The first reality is that manufacturing industry takes time. If I look at the nuclear industry, the skills and talents, know-how, things that are built up over decades. We can find finance fairly rapidly in some cases, but we can't build a strategic value chain so quickly. We need to train engineers, technicians, develop technologies. We need to create industrial ecosystems and build infrastructure. All of that requires consistency. And so one of the key issues for me is public policy stability. I think industrialists know how to adapt, but they need visibility over the long-term energy choices and infrastructure choices. We've talked about strategic priorities, and one of the things that I noticed is that throughout the world there are countries that are doing it. The USA is investing, China is investing, India is investing. Europe needs to follow this long-term investment approach. Industrial sovereignty isn't something that is built from top-down decrees. It's built from the grassroots up with consistency on ongoing investment. The major fuel for industry is confidence in the long term. Ms. Piet, you talked about the outlook for new industries and our need for energy. My question is, can the electricity industry create new industries, new jobs here in France and in Europe? Yes, absolutely. When RTA creates one job, our figure is that we create 7 jobs in the downstream supply chain. It's really important for us to create jobs and to build with French and European companies, and that's exactly what we're doing. We find it really important because if we're talking about energy sovereignty, we need to see that right across the value chain. So industrial sovereignty is part of the picture. RTE is funded by a regulated tariff that French energy consumers pay. Money is borrowed from a French organization called the Caisse d'Épargne, which is funded again by taxpayers. So it's very important to us that these savings are used as wisely as possible and come back to fund the industrial chain. So we carry out a number of key actions. We are working on some of the key materials that we need to use, and sometimes some of these pieces of equipment take up to 4 years to manufacture. That's why the lead times for grid connections are so long. We need to look forward in a strategic manner because we're not the only ones investing. All of our neighbours around Europe are currently making the same type of investments on almost the same scale. since we're all drawing on the same industrial base in France and in Europe, we need to look forward and coordinate and cooperate together. In France, we've created an association called FIER. It brings together RTE, the Enedis distribution grid, and the various trade unions in the area, the ones for electrical wiring, the electricity transmission and so on. This is an association that's only been in existence for about a year, and we are working together with the unions in order to give both the businesses and the trade unions visibility in terms of the order book to enable them to invest. We can tell them about the investment streams that they can use and the finance they can use. And then we talk about their recruitment and skills needs. By 2030, this sector is going to need to recruit 43,000 people. That's massive. So the question of hiring and education, these questions are massive. And that's the type of thing that we're talking about today in order to be ready tomorrow. You talked about a change of software, a paradigm shift. We often talked about things in individual enterprise terms. Mr. Pascal, you talked about an ecosystem. Should we be thinking about ecosystems or individual enterprises? Well, very clearly, I would say we need to talk about ecosystems. We need to form a French team or a European team in our different industrial sectors. In the aviation sector, we have a French team. We've got a very dynamic manufacturing sector. It could be even more dynamic, but it needs further support. We need to move beyond this false image of industry that hasn't been able to decarbonize. Decarbonize is happening. Our industrial sector is very rich. Most people who fly are less than 35 years old. It's a different image to what we have. Only 14% of the higher socioeconomic classes take the plane. So this is a sector where growth is not assured eternally. There's severe competition. So we need to back France's aviation team. We've got Airbus, Safran, Thales, Dassault, ADP, Air France. We all work together. We know how to work together. And similarly, we need to take a new perspective and think not necessarily in terms of a totally unified ecosystem, but perhaps a coordinated system where we are partners together. That's what we've tried to do with Air France. We've built a solid partnership because we have the Shanghai with Singapore Airlines. We've got Emirates and Dubai airports. There's very often a partnership between an airport and an airline, and that's something that's been difficult to build in Europe because of competition laws, because of the laws about market position and new entrants on the market. If we think about the ecosystem, we need to protect the ecosystem and instead of putting spanners in the works every time it started to grow. This raises the question of how we can reindustrialize. And the figure that was in the Draghi report struck me. Europe needs 750 to 800 billion euros in additional investment by 2030. That seems massive. And 40% of savings that Europeans have is in savings accounts rather than investments. How can we use capital and investment? How can the single capital market help? Olivier, let me give you an analogy. It's the World Cup at the moment, but I'm going to talk about another sport. I'm going to talk about F1. On the starting grid within F1, I would say that China is in pole position in terms of competitiveness, and we're right near the back of the grid. In order to win, there are 4 components that we need. The first is finance. We need a team that is ready to invest. An F1 team that doesn't invest declines. And in terms of investment, we need a lot of that. One of the key areas is going to be AI. We're very proud because in Europe we want to spend 200 billion in invest AI to connect data centers in. That's a 4-year investment program, but the only problem is that over the same period, USA is spending 800 billion in 1 year. So we're spending 16 times less than the USA. Investment capital is one thing. We need to build a single capital market in Europe. We've been talking about it for a long time. It's one of the things that Draghi report talked about, but it seems to have been swept under the carpet and we're not talking about it anymore. That's a key thing. We need finance. The second thing is we need the best car with the best engine to win, and that's about AI. I'm convinced that that is the baseline for the world's new competition. We talk about token-based competition. And AI is basically Chinese or American. We don't really exist within Europe. We've got Mistral, which is a great company. We hope there'll be a coalition of other companies around Mistral, and I hope that there will be other investments around that. The other key player is Ami Labs. It's a startup to be founded by Yann Lequin. In robotics, we talk about world models. A world model is what's going to help the robot understand the world around it, and when it does an action, understanding what the consequences of its actions are going to be. And that enables robots to learn their actions and their consequences. This is a major technological challenge, and we have Ami Labs, Yann Lequin's company, which is trying to meet this challenge, and we're pretty proud of that. That's a second component. The third component is energy. You need fuel in the tank. At the moment, we've got a choice between gas and electricity. We don't have any gas. We buy it from the Russians or from the US, 4 times more expensive than the Americans buy it. So we need to roll out electrification. Currently, industrial manufacturing uses only 30% electricity. It's the same level as China, but China is moving forward much quicker in that. So we need to accelerate and move forward quicker in this area. And the fourth point, the fourth thing that's going to be important is regulation. You know that in F1, the FIA sets the rules and the standards for the race, and there's now a new mode, an overtake mode, where when you're on a straight, you can use overtake mode to overtake. And it's like in Europe, we haven't got overtake mode. Other competitors do have it. Our issue is regulation. We've got an incredible level of regulation. In a classic city car, there's 30% more regulation in Europe than in other markets. So in order to win the race, we need to bring our regulation to the same level as other competitors. I think we can win the race because we're only on the starting line right now. The race is still ahead of us, but we really need to change our approach. If we hear you right, it sounds like everything's there, but we're struggling to put it together. So, Mr. Stiesel, are we too afraid to innovate and to look to the future? Do we need to take more risks within Europe?
I don't think we need to take more risks. I think we just need to act in consequence of the situation that we are in. The good thing is, when we look at energy sovereignty, is that we don't need any new technologies. We need to be innovative, of course, which means putting new ideas to the market, which means keep on developing. But it's not so that we sit and wait for breakthrough technologies that can get us out of the trap. Fortunately, that's not the case. We need to do, of course, big investments in getting to energy sovereignty. But in that context, a couple of figures matter. Today, we import for about 350 to 400 billion euros every year of fossil fuels from outside Europe. It's like having the big power plants, having big ovens that burn banknotes. If we were to get to energy sovereignty in something on the order of 20 years, we need to spend 200 million a year on building up that capacity. But they will be assets that we own. They don't disappear like the fossil fuel that we imported. So if you look at the risks, I think my most important message in that context is that there is no technical risk. It's not so that this is not doable. You can say that there is a risk that Trump will be annoyed if we don't care that he wants the United States to be energy dominant, which is what they want. We can say that the Chinese can play games as we become independent because that's not in their interest. They could be the risks, but I consider them to be fully manageable if we get the European and the national interests aligned in saying we don't want to be blackmailable. We want to be sovereign.
Monsieur Maillard, vous travaillez avec des risques tous les jours. Est-ce qu'on a trop peur?
Mr. Mayer, you talk about risk all the time. Have we got too many risks? Are we too afraid? Sometimes, yes, we want to be reassured, and to reassure ourselves, we over-regulate. We set up standards. A lot of standards are required or requested by companies in order to create a level playing field. So we do need to distinguish between regulations that are driven by the European Union and transposed by the national governments. France tends to over-transpose these regulations because we like to go further and faster than our neighbours. I don't think it's necessarily a positive thing. We can just do the same as our neighbours sometimes. I think we see that in the morning we're saying there's too many standards, but in the afternoon we want more standards. We want to compare with others. There's regulation about the CBAM, the carbon-based adjustment mechanism, to take into account CO2 in products that are brought into Europe in order to compare imported products and set an even price. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? We can understand the rationale for it, but it's quite complex to set up. There's a lot of management costs that go along with it. So that's the type of thing we need to think about when we talk in terms of regulation. This need to reassure ourselves, this need for security is perhaps translated too much into standards. It's said sometimes that in USA things happen and we regulate later. In Europe we tend to regulate first and then let things happen afterwards. But I think we can change in Europe. There are examples that show that we can go further and faster in compliance with the rules, because we're the ones that choose to set the rules. If we decide to take into account the climate change impacts, that's something that we need to think about and take into account. We can't say, oh, it's a bit of a problem when it's a factory, but I want to apply it in other areas. I think it's important to have an overview and to make sensible choices in order to help industrialists. It's a long-term issue, and our industries need visibility.
When we see Europe, we're competing with China, which evolves at an amazing speed. Now, when we see what takes place in other parts of the world, especially China, how could we in France and Europe reach such a speed to reindustrialize? There is no miracle recipe. We need to use our forces. This could be illustrated in a specific domain, which is singularity. You know, in fact, I think it is a pillar of industrial power, because energy transition will change deeply the issue of resource. And often we discuss it in many fora. Critical needs will increase. We talk about China with rare earths. In this context, I think recycling is not an issue of environmental policy. It is purely industrial policy and sovereignty. In the nuclear industry, France has decided to treat and recycle waste fuels. You know, it's something we don't share with many pays, except for Russia, maybe China, Japan, is trying to do it again. This experience shows that a material that has been used could be again strategic material. It could be the case in batteries. We see in Europe, you know, we were trying to have this industry in critical metals, permanent magnets present all over the place, you know, in wind farms and so on. So countries which will have the mastery of such technologies will have self-supplies, will reduce their dependency, will be able to have high added value industrial development. This industrial rebound will not come necessarily from new plants only, but it will come also from our ability to have a full control over the value chain of raw material from the ore to recycled waste. So this sovereignty will create a sustainable industry for our beautiful Europe. Olivier Scalable. When we hear what you say, you know, this acceleration, you know, is it possible when you're 27? That's a good question. You know, 2 years ago, I remember we had Professor Draghi, and after 2 years, we're happy because we said 30% of the Draghi report has been implemented. 2 years. So the notion of speed is essential. Now, to do this, I think we have to be highly pragmatic. It's a complete change in Europe, you know. We have to think about producers and consumers. But the problem is that we can't do it everywhere, and we can't do it being 27. 3 critical domains: energy, technology, and capitals. A company needs the 3 elements to function. If we could just concentrate on that and do things well, it will be good news already. Second thing is that 27, it's impossible. We will not have the right speed, you know. The answer is in the question. I don't think so. We have to have coalitions, 5, 7 countries which will agree to deal with the 3 topics and move them forward. It's possible in your treaty. It's called Reinforced Cooperation, Article 20. We don't need to remake Europe to do that. And we'll have to do it in an accelerated manner. And I think politicians need a probe to be boosted. And I interviewed 14 CEOs in France and in Germany. They all agree about what needs to be done. You know, Draghi by the book. But they are ready to get onto it, you know, put the hands on, help the European Union address the issue correctly at a good speed, ready for cooperation. Maybe this is good news, so we can all try to do it and get together for things to move. Several of you did criticize the European regulations. Could this be an asset as well versus other regions like China? Well, at the European level, clearly, well, you did mention the Draghi report, but I think beyond the simple issue of regulation is the Letta report should be applied, the one which said we need a single market. And what I see, and then we need 27 countries to have a single market, very much like the capital market. And there it's work in progress, yes, exactly. So the European electricity market does exist. There are rules, common rules. There is solidarity. That is, countries help one another when there is a problem, for example, as we had at the time of the Spanish blackout. So there is a solidarity, and the question is not so much that of the rules, but the way we deploy or implement them. And it is true that right now we do have a text which is moving on, the Greens package, which is quite promising in the sense that the idea is to develop interconnections and to develop this European market. And I think, I would like to insist on this notion of market. The fact that we are a European market means that, well, we do have cheap decarbonated electricity, which is not the case all over Europe, and which we more expensive than the US and China in terms of, so this European market should make it possible to be more competitive versus China or the US. So things are evolving. It does exist. France has 37 interconnection with 7 border countries. You know, interconnections are all over the place. We have to continue that. It will make it possible for other countries to speed up their decarbonation process, which is beneficial for us because, you know, exporting electricity in France, it's 4 billion euros. You know, it's huge. And for RTE, the income from interconnection is 1.6 billion euros. So it's quite significant, and this allows us to do investments. So the text is going on. We have to do it with the member states. We have to think interconnection, but also reinforcement of domestic networks or grids, and the energy mix from the various countries. Well, you know, we don't have to agree about every mix, but we should have this concern for the open market and competitiveness versus the other zones of the world. Last question, Mr. Pascal. If you were to choose one thing that should take place now to do reindustrialization, what would it be? One word. Well, we talked about ecosystems, we talked about investment, we talked about the speed and rhythm. It's a combination, is the three. Rhythm is feasible, you know, the pace, it's a question of agility, regulation, ways of working. The European team is accessible if today there is everybody becomes aware of the industrial assets we have. And finally, investment means that there should be stability, foreseeable situations, and a stable situation, and this can be put forward. Simply, we need a true will, a true common orientation to implement that. Thank you so much. Thank you for this discussion. Thank you to conclude, Helmut, back to you for a very brief summary of the discussion. So what can we learn from this discussion? Well, what I keep is that we don't want to hope for an industrial rebound. We have to build for SS systems. You used it indeed. Technologies today, well, rupture technologies are systemic technologies. AI depends on semiconductor, which depends on lithography, energy, critical material, data centers, which consume energy. So there is a system. I will spare you the details, you know, but quantic or quantum computation, the paradox in the system that we have to make choices. We have to make choices because if you look, an article was published in Nature which says that it assesses the global innovation in the last 50 years. Well, we got technological revolution, we can see every day AI, quantum, and so on and so forth. But when you look at the share of rupture innovation, the deep techs, they decline versus the incremental innovations, which are exploding. You know, we change the form of products. So we clearly have to stop thinking that all innovations are equal. We have to make choice. Selection is the second S. How do we select? We have to select the ecosystems to be supported, you said it. We have to select the public policies that are too scattered. The Crédit Impôt Recherche, we said it, it's scattering 7 to 8 million euros, you know, when they, you know, so we have to select. Then we have to take into account the fact that we got military expenditures which increase. There could be an eviction effect on research. Good news is that dual research, which are used for military and civilians, 2/3 of innovation comes from civil, from academic research or from research in businesses. It did progress. There are ecosystem mechanisms which work well, France 2030, ANL, but we are shooting them in flight. So there's an issue of trajectory. And the third S, select, second one, third one, you know, risk research, you know, instead of financing any research. Third S, sovereignty. discussed it, you know, dual research and sovereignty is to be thought by things that we change. The world has changed. Technology do not circulate freely. Export restrictions, you know, exist. You love the 2016 Anthropic, you get even more. Export restriction will proliferate. So we're in the world where knowledge does no longer circulate freely. We do R&D, but there are issues of scattering, diffusion. For me, what comes out of this solution is Europe, stop the fragmentation of financial market, and then solution is good cooperation with the South. You know, when we look at the AI competence, they're in India mainly, you know, OCDE data, US, Germany, China, and clearly France doesn't play in the same ground. So we're not in the same league. So, you know, we have to change our sovereignty. Thank you, Helmut. Thank you all. And thank you, all the participants. Good evening.